Hello, welcome to the Texas Bitcoin Frontier Roundtable discussion on history of Bitcoin. Sorry for starting late, trying to figure out the microphone, the other technologies, but we're running now. So today we're going to talk about how Bitcoin works, and next time we're going to talk about the value of Bitcoin, how its functioning affects its value. Well, let's jump right in, I guess. Michael, what is your favorite thing about the design of Bitcoin?
The blockchain, obviously.
Yeah, I like that part too. In fact, some people say that Bitcoin is the blockchain, and I would agree with that. If we could totally overhaul totally different software in the program and communicating in a totally different ways with one another. But as long as everybody is building the blockchain according to the same rules, then we still have Bitcoin. But what is the blockchain? I forgot. You have to explain it.
I thought you were doing the lecture tonight, so.
No, it doesn't. Either one of us can answer the question. It's fine. Okay, so the blockchain, it's actually a tree, technically speaking. It is not a chain, although there is an incentive for people to build along a chain and for any branches off that chain to be very short. But it's technically what's called a Merkle tree. And what this means is that each node in the tree is attached to the previous node because it holds the hash of the previous node. And this means that the tree is secure. So I can send you information about the tree, and you can verify that it's built correctly. They didn't make up a bunch of stuff. And there's also the difficulty. So each node has to have some proof of work attached to it, and this allows you to verify that a new node is the correct one. Whichever one has the highest difficulty, that one is the one you assume is correct. There's one of these nodes comes out every 10 minutes on average, and each one contains a set of transactions, a consistent set. This is how we resolve the double spending problem. If there are inconsistent transactions sent throughout the network, the nodes in the blockchain, the blocks, they resolve which ones are established as being the real ones. Anybody can create blocks and shoot them out into the network, but most people do not have the computing resources to be able to create blocks very consistently. In fact, that's an important part of the functioning of Bitcoin, is we don't want anybody to be that powerful. We want everybody to be able to create blocks with a very low probability, which makes it very difficult for any single entity to have an overwhelming influence in the network. Did I miss anything? How does that sound?
Sound pretty good. But then I guess the question is, what exactly is this proof of work? A lot of people describe it incorrectly as just like these really complex mathematical puzzles or problems that you have to solve.
Oh yeah, I hate that.
Yeah, when in actuality it's it's just a SHA-256.
Yeah.
So could you explain the actual
Sure.
goings on of proof of work?
Right. So there isn't anything. There isn't anything about. There isn't like some sort of a numerological constraint that Bitcoin has to satisfy because of like some mathematical reason. The whole point of proof of work is that's it, proof that you did work. And it really doesn't matter what work you did. So when we have a problem that is difficult to, we have a function that's difficult to invert, but easy to run. This is called a one-way function in cryptography. We can turn it into a proof of work by saying that you don't have to totally invert the function for some value. Instead, you have to find a value that satisfies a particular property when the function is run on it. So in Bitcoin, we just say that we have to find a number whose value, when the one-way function is applied to it, has a certain amount of leading zeros. And each new leading zero halves the probability of being able to find it. There isn't any trick that allows you to compute this more quickly. You just have to try lots and lots of different numbers until you find one that works. There's nothing really mathematical about SHA-256, which is the hash function that we use for this. Nothing mathematical. It's just like shuffling cards. It's like mixing numbers together. It's just jumbling stuff up, and there isn't a way to invert it quickly. So it is good as a proof of work. That's all you're doing, proving that you did work. And whoever does the most work is the winner.
Right. Well, so we've seen articles. There's Ken Sheriff did the thing where it's like SHA-256 by hand.
Yes.
So you can actually do it all by hand. Computers just help you do it faster, and the internet just helps you transmit that information to the entire network faster.
Yeah.
But if we want to imagine Bitcoin without all the computers and stuff, we can imagine, a proof of work where it's just coin flips.
Yeah.
Which would be equivalent to having the leading zeros. And so you have to get a certain number of coin flips in a row.
Well, of course, then you'd have to be able to prove it to other people.
Which is difficult, yes. I mean, like if you have a room of people trying to
but
have
say
this distributed consensus.
Say everybody had the same coin flipping machine and they were all perfectly synchronized according to the laws of physics and chaos theory and everything, then you could use that because it would just act like a random number generator, and you could, but people could verify the seed. The problem with flipping coins is we can't pass the seed around. But
for a simpler example of this sort of probabilistic function.
Yeah. Well, so effectively, one-way functions have to act like pseudo-random number generators. So yeah, that's basically what we're doing. One of the interesting things about this article you mentioned is the author points out that doing the SHA-256 is just dumb, and it's not that difficult. I mean, it takes up a sheet of paper to do the whole thing, but the operations are very simple operations. Whereas doing the elliptic curve math, that's like crazy difficult.
And there's been good articles on that as well, like going through all the math. I think Chain.com released an article that took you through the steps.
Oh yeah, math. I think I've seen that.
It's a very long article.
Yeah.
And an important thing with that is the mining is simply a way for people to solve the consensus problem. It doesn't have to do with like securing the actual messages themselves.
Yeah. So when I first learned about Bitcoin, I didn't know anything about cryptography. So I was like, why are there 21 million coins? And I was sort of imagining that Satoshi had solved some kind of math problem that the answer came out to be 21 million, and it was all sort of there was some kind of constraint that had to be solved in order to do the digital cash thing, but it's really nothing like that at all.
It just happened to be where the supply curve ended up.
Yeah.
Where the asymptote for the geometric series was.
So let's talk about the supply of Bitcoin. So we have this database called the blockchain, and the longest, well, technically the most difficult chain is considered to be the true one, the real one. Now, this is a big difference from Bitcoin to what we talked about last time with BitGold and B-Money, because what I pointed out last week is that although the authors propose to produce some kind of consensus on certain issues, like how much money is going to be created in each round, right? They're actually unable to provide that kind of consensus because the value of proof of work is the same to anybody. So if B-Money tries to limit the money supply, I could just make my own proof of work coin, and it should be basically interchangeable with B-Money. And alt B-Money is a perfect substitute. I mean, it wouldn't really be perfect, but it should act as a substitute. But with Bitcoin, Bitcoin is able to provide a consensus. And the reason it does this, the reason it's able to work this way, is that you have to be invested in the Bitcoin network in order to get a benefit from it. So with B-Money or BitGold, there isn't any particular investment other than creating the proof of work, which anybody can do, and doesn't require investment in the particular system. But with Bitcoin, you do some arbitrary proof of work, and Bitcoin doesn't care, and neither does anybody else. You have to follow the rules of the Bitcoin system in order to create a block, and that block is worth nothing if there isn't Bitcoin. So once you're invested in the network, then you have to follow the rules of the network, or else you're acting to harm your own investment. This is what allows the consensus to happen. This is why people have the incentive to create this consensus. So every time we have two competing blocks that are both built off of the same preceding one, the network decides upon one of them arbitrarily, or if one has a lower difficulty, it'll choose the higher difficulty block. But it can be just an arbitrary choice. But it will select one eventually, and everyone will proceed from there. And whoever created the orphan block, they're just screwed. But they have to keep playing along too.
Right.
So initially, each new block allows the creator to credit 50 Bitcoins to themselves, to any public key that they want. every 4 years worth of blocks, the reward halves. So people sometimes say that, you know, the last Bitcoin is created in the year 2040, 2140, something around there.
So they're actually already created.
Well, what I was going to say is like 99% of all the Bitcoins are going to be out, you know, relatively soon.
I think like close to like 2030, 2040 or so.
In the next 20 years or so, we're going to get nearly all the Bitcoins. And the fact that the reward ends at 2040, that's just because Bitcoin has 8 decimal places, 8 places past the decimal point. And if it had more, the rewards would continue, but they'd just be more and more infinitesimally small. So eventually, you know, people are going to be mining Bitcoins, and the amount that they're going to get is going to be below the dust threshold. So people might not even bother redeeming those coins. So you were making an important point earlier. What were you saying?
Which point was it? I make a lot of brilliant
points. That's true. So. Yeah. So let's see. Oh, right. About when the Bitcoin is created, or
right.
the inflation of Bitcoin.
Right. And so we can actually think of it more as an allocation process rather than a creation process.
Yeah. I agree. So since we know the release schedule beforehand, from beginning to end, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that Bitcoin, to call this inflation, because it's already factored into the price when people trade it. They know that there are a certain, right now there's around 9 million coins that are not claimed, I think. And they know that those exist, and they know that they're going to exist eventually, and people are going to be trading with them. They just can't yet. So they trade with that information in mind. And there isn't any reason to expect the creation of new coins to put downward pressure on the price, which is totally different from the way government inflation works. The whole point of government inflation is that you have to surprise people with the new money, or else they don't get the benefit from it.
Right.
The government
you rely on the Cantillon effects.
Yeah. The Cantillon effect, is that what that's called?
Well, the money being non-neutral, it takes more time for the prices to react to the increase in it.
Yeah.
So if they all increased immediately, then that person wouldn't get to have extra money to get at the current price, like get more goods at the current prices before they react.
So let's see, another thing about the supply. Oh yeah, so people say that there's 21 million Bitcoins. Actually, it's slightly less because because since the reward just halves, but there are decimal rounding errors eventually, we end up with a tiny amount less than the full 21 million. But it doesn't matter because the number is arbitrary.
Well, and then even then, so many coins have been lost or simply like thrown out in the history of Bitcoin. So it'll be interesting to see what that number actually is, although there's no real way to know because you can't have a way to look at the blockchain to know the difference between money being saved and money that's completely lost.
Yeah. Speaking of lost Bitcoins, we should work on getting our own quantum computer, because there may be Bitcoins that were mined but never spent, but the public key for those is public.
Right, so if we can brute force it the other way, then it can be ours.
Yes, so we should do that. So let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin transactions, because this is an important point about how transactions work. Normally, when you receive a Bitcoin transaction, the Bitcoins are sent to an address. And the Bitcoin address is not a public key, it's a hash of a public key with a checksum attached to it. But it's basically a hash. So then when you redeem those Bitcoins, you have to send a proof that you can create a digital signature that with a private key that corresponds to the public key that was used to create that hash. You don't reveal the public key until the Bitcoins are redeemed. You have to show the public key when you redeem the Bitcoins, because otherwise you can't create that proof. Well, theoretically, you could have like a zero knowledge kind of thing, but you know, that we don't have the capacity to do that quite yet. But in the Coinbase transaction, that is the transaction that a miner adds to his new block to redeem the new Bitcoins. That one is send to public key, so you reveal the public key on that one. And those are the two most important kinds of transactions in Bitcoin. But we can actually do all kinds of crazy stuff with Bitcoin transactions. So do you want to like list a couple?
Yeah, well, there's the multi-signature transactions you can do where you have to have multiple valid signatures based on a set of public keys in the output. And then you have stuff like pay to script hash, which you can create like a much more complex hash that you have to prove in order to be able to spend it.
Yeah.
You could probably explain that better than I could.
Well, I'm pretty sure you have your address begins with a 3, and that's how you know that it's a pay to script hash. So instead of hashing the public key, you have a Bitcoin script. Every transaction has a little script that explains how it can be redeemed. So you create your own Bitcoin script, and if the script evaluates to true and its hash is the address, then
it's considered valid and you can spend it.
Right.
And with that, you can have all kinds of interesting signature hashes. There's the anyone can pay one.
Yeah.
That allows you to have a sort of assurance contract setup.
Yeah.
Like Kickstarter.
And the way that these work is it depends on how the digital signature is produced. So if you think about it, like I send out say I want to redeem a transaction. So there's a transaction sent to a given address, and I want to prove that it's mine. I have to sign my redemption, proof. That's an input. That's called an input in Bitcoin. It's the proof that I can redeem an output, right? But the signature has to be part of the redemption. So there's kind of a problem there, because you can't sign something that has its own signature in it. There's no way to solve that problem quickly. That would violate the rules of cryptography, because you would have to be able to invert the digital signature, right? So every time you send out these inputs, there's rules about how the digital signature is created, which say that certain parts are blanked out first. And so when we verify the input, we blank parts of it out, and then we verify the signature based on that. And this is what causes transaction malleability, because for certain transactions there are rules about which parts you blank out, and some of them it's quite a lot. So you can sort of reconstruct the transaction, and the signature will still be valid because of the parts that you can cross out when you verify it. So this allows us to do a lot of interesting kinds of payments, right? So you can create a transaction and allow other people to add inputs to it, so that your transaction, your signature is still valid. And this is how we do the assurance contract, right? We have a transaction that's invalid because there's not enough inputs for the total amount of outputs. So we have a digital signature that includes my input and the output, and other people can add their own inputs to it without changing the rules as to how my signature was created. So eventually we have a transaction that's big enough to account for the output, and then it's valid.
Right.
So that's pretty cool. But these kinds of rules do make Bitcoin, the nuts and bolts, pretty complicated.
Right. Yeah.
So right now there's a function called isStandard, which determines whether a node relays a transaction. And there are several standard types of transactions. And the reason we do this is it's very difficult to prove that some arbitrary Bitcoin script is not going to break the system. Bitcoin could be, well, I mean, we don't have proof that everything about the Bitcoin scripting language works correctly.
So we limit it to what we know does work.
Yeah.
For now, until we can slowly build up confidence in certain types of programming.
Yeah. So what the devs do is they come up with standard types of transactions and make sure those are tested all nicely, and then those kind of transactions will propagate throughout the network, but arbitrary ones do not.
Right.
How long have we been talking? Where's your clock? Oh, we've only been talking half an hour. Seems like a lot, but I don't know. What else is there in Bitcoin? You did a pretty good job.
Yeah. Well, I guess you can tie it back. If we could go back to the consensus thing and tie it back to the first lecture you gave on reciprocal altruism. A long time ago, you wrote an article called "The Proof of Work Concept," and you connected Bitcoin mining to the biological concept of the handicap principle.
Oh, sure.
So since we talked about that at the first lecture, can you now bring it back and explain how that connects in Bitcoin?
Well, actually, well, first let's go back to the previous talk, because one of my criticisms of B-Money and BitGold is that there isn't any reason for the currency units to be fungible in those systems. But there is with Bitcoin, and why don't we first talk about why that is? So in B-Money and BitGold, your ownership of a given proof of work string which is arbitrarily, assigned a certain number of currency units. Your ownership is determined by the fact that a number of servers receive the message that they're yours now, and it's digitally signed by the last person who had it. But what you own is the original proof of work string that created the currency, B money or BitGold. And this string could have been made years ago, or it could have been made just a few minutes ago. And there isn't any reason that amounts of proof of work will have a consistent price over time. So, and the value should actually change very rapidly because of Moore's law. As computers get more and more powerful, the value of a particular proof of work for any arbitrary purpose becomes less and less, because everybody else gets better at doing work.
If I remember correctly, Nick Szabo even compares sort of BitGold to like collecting stamps. Is that?
I don't think so. I don't remember. I think somebody asked a question about that last week. I don't think it was Nick Szabo though. But he has this idea of a collectibles, and
right.
These are a kind of currency, a kind of proto money is what he called it.
Yeah.
And but in order for a collectible to work, basically a collectible is something that is scarce because of the human labor required to create
right.
it.
So it's effectively unforgeable.
Right. So we could use, if we were a hunter-gatherer tribe, we could use beads as money, even if they're made out of something that the material isn't valuable, like clay or shells or whatever.
Because you have to transform it into a good that takes effort.
Because if we have to work to create every little bead, that you just can't make that much. So the beads are going to be scarce just by virtue of the fact that we don't have mass production. Then when the Europeans come over and start
and they do have mass production,
then we're fucked. Right. And that has happened to many poor native peoples around the world. Of course, not well, lots of bad things happen when Europeans show up, but that's what happens to the currency. But we have
Bitcoin, on the other hand, as it does this, it just secures the network even more, given that there's not a single entity that has more than 51% of that.
The difference is that the B money and BitGold, the proof of work is sort of past oriented. And they have this, it's like a labor theory of value thing. Like you put work into it, so the thing should be valuable. Well, not necessarily. And there isn't any necessary reason that people are going to value it in the way that you might want. But with Bitcoin, the proof of work is always future oriented, because you know that there will be a continual string of new proof of work in the network. And that's what you are relying on to secure the network, is the future proof of work that's going to go into it. The past matters insofar as how difficult is it to create a new, more difficult chain. That's called the 51% attack, because you need 51% of the network to do that reliably. But your ownership of coins when you get them is based on the future amounts of work that people are going to put into the network, not so much the past amounts, or at least everybody has the same past amounts of proof of work, and there really isn't any connection between your ownership of an output and the work that was originally used to create the Bitcoins. What matters is the work that needs to be, it's required to change your output now, and what's going to secure it in the future. So that's why we can expect Bitcoins to be fungible, unlike B-money and Bitcoin, is whenever you receive Bitcoins, you always get the same thing. Everybody at that moment in time is getting the same thing. They're getting an output that's secured by a certain amount of proof of work, and that is and will continue to be secured in the same way as time goes on, as long as they continue to hold it. So yeah, let's talk about this handicap stuff now. The handicap principle is an idea in biology, which says that a meaningful message basically has proof of work attached to it. There has to be a cost attached to the message, and it has to be verifiable by other animals in order for them to believe it. So the handicap principle gets us cooperation even when there isn't necessarily any expected future returns. So when we talked about reciprocal altruism, that works if a group of animals knows that they're going to be continually interacting in the future. There's reason to sort of invest in one another now, because the returns over time will be greater than if they all just beat up on each other, right? But when we're talking about two people or animals who don't know each other and aren't necessarily going to come in contact again, the handicap principle can allow them to signal goodwill to one another without any expectation of returning. The way it works is, I want to prove to you that I am a cooperator and not a con artist or something. So what I do is I demonstrate a cost which I could only do consistently if I actually expected to get the kind of returns from you from a cooperative interaction, a kind of cost that a very short-term thinker would not be able to incur. So someone with a high time preference is going to be willing to incur costs now in return for future benefits, whereas a short-term thinker is not. And of course, a short-term thinker is also someone who's going to be a con artist rather than a legitimate businessman or whatever. And in this case, I prove that I am future-oriented, and it doesn't matter that we may not be interacting later. Because if I have the future-oriented mindset, then we can have a mutually beneficial trade. An example of this is an antelope wants to signal to a cheetah that it's in the prime of health and isn't worth attacking because it'll get away. So what the antelope will do is it'll jump up and down a few times when it notices the cheetah, thus keeping it in danger, right? It is not running away, it's staying nearby to the cheetah and just sort of playing around a little bit before it runs away. So what it's saying is, I can afford to I can afford to take the risk of being attacked because I'm pretty strong and I can run away. So it's a reliable signal, and the cheetah and the antelope are cooperating, even though they don't necessarily, even though
to eat the other.
Right, yes, and it goes the other way too, because a cheetah's pattern is cryptic from a certain distance. That means it's difficult to identify. They just look a flat gray and they blend in. But after a certain distance, they get close enough, then you can start to see the pattern. And so, you know, the antelopes are like, oh shit, a cheetah, right? So the cheetah, if it wants to identify animals that are weak and slow, that it has a good chance of bringing down, it needs to reliably alarm the animals so that they'll actually run away as fast as they can. So when it approaches and it has this pattern that can be identified from a certain distance.
So if it takes more time for it to finally get recognized, you know that it doesn't have as good of, the antelope doesn't have as good of eyesight.
Well, the cheetah is giving the reliable signal here, because it's saying like, I'm a great predator because I can afford to show you myself from a certain distance.
Gotcha.
Then they run, and the ones that don't run as fast are more likely to be really ones that are not strong enough, or that are weaker. So the way that this idea is relevant for, well, so the handicap principle applies a lot in animal contests. So like deer antlers or the peacock's tail, like these
sexual selection,
these crazy signals that, you know, animals have attached to themselves to show that they're well groomed and healthy and so on. Like these are handicaps, right? Like antlers are like heavy objects that you carry around all the time, and they're not very good for fighting. I always think of like the Klingon batleth, which is like such an obviously awkward weapon. That's kind of like antlers, right? But they're good for assessing one another's strengths. So they're good for contests, not good for actual fighting. So we see there's a contest in Bitcoin that is exactly the same, because whoever has the greatest handicap is the one who gets to create the block, and the handicap is the proof of work. And so, you know, people say, well, it's not really a handicap because then they get the Bitcoins, right? But I mean, you can say the same thing about the deer and the peacock, right? Because whoever has the craziest appendages, right? They get all the females.
Yeah, they get all, and just social dominance in general.
So if you were interviewing the deer, he would say, well, it's not really a handicap because I need it for, you know, having sex, right? And it's the same, but it's the same thing. Like it is
the reason why you would invest in it,
right?
At all,
exactly. And of course, there isn't any proof when it's not known for certain, if you invest in Bitcoin mining, that you will actually make a profit. And like miners aren't making profits now. It's a war of attrition right now. And the handicap principle applies to it. So one of the things that we can show with game theory is that under certain circumstances, it is rational for everyone to enter a contest, even if they're the worst at the contest. And we we have mathematical models that show that a weak deer, say, might be more fit if it doesn't have antlers, because it can be a little bit stronger and fatter. But because it's not entering into the contest, it receives no attention from the females. Like, it's not worth it to examine the people who don't enter the contest, because that takes more, it would take more effort to assess them. So just ignore those people and only look at the people entering the contest, right? And so even though the males in the contest have to expend resources and are not able to get as strong and as fat as males who do not, they will be the ones who win out. And this principle can take over a whole population. And that's just what happens in Bitcoin. It's not like everybody does Bitcoin mining,
right?
But it is the case that everybody treats the contest as something significant that they pay attention to, and this is why the consensus works. It's really all based on game theory. Like, once we have the contest, then and we have this reason to form a consensus, there's an incentive for everybody to just go by the results of the contest, even though it is kind of meaningless. Like, there isn't any reason that we should listen to somebody who has more ASIC machines than somebody else, right? There isn't, it's not like they have any special insight. It's just that this system works to produce the consensus, and we have an incentive to form one, so that's
go with it.
Right, that's what we use. And you can expect that everybody is going to is also going to rely on the contest. You can't. Someone who tries to ignore the contest will just be ignored by everybody else. So everybody has to follow it. And I'm going to write another article that explains that better, because I think my first one didn't quite get through all of that. I'm working on one now. It'll come out eventually. So that's basically how Bitcoin works. I mean, since we don't have anybody else around today, I don't know if we can just keep talking about anything, but I think we've gone through all the important stuff. And next time we'll talk about the value of Bitcoin and the economics, and you know, what causes Bitcoin's value. We have one viewer. I wonder. I hope you enjoy. So I don't know. Do you have anything else? Do you have any questions?
No.
Well, you already know everything too. So, you know, here's something I've been wondering about. Isn't Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme?
I heard it's made of tulips.
Yeah, it's just like the tulip mania. It's really, well, you know, this is why it's really great to bring in these game theory ideas, because we have very good models which show that if there is this consensus about how people are going to be altruistic to one another, there's an incentive for everybody else to enter in to do it.
Right, and the people that say Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme are mistaken. They're seeing that occur, and they're mistaking it for the phenomenon of people like kind of a multi-level marketing scheme or a or like a Ponzi scheme where you're just trying to get the next person's money so you can find yourself a cash out. So they're seeing people go into this consensus and they're mistaking it for that.
So imagine a multi-level marketing scheme in which the entire population was participating.
Right.
Does that make any sense?
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's what money is.
Well, my point is that it doesn't make any, like an actual multi-level marketing system. It couldn't work if everybody was doing it, right?
Oh, right. Yes.
It only works if some people are doing it and everybody else is being exploited. But there isn't.
Right, but this one, like when you're like the people who aren't in it, you want them to enter not so you can exploit them.
Right. So with Bitcoin, there isn't. You can just have everybody use Bitcoin,
right?
And there isn't any logical problem there.
Right. You can't run out at the end.
Yeah.
In fact, it's better when that last person finally gets over to Bitcoin.
So yeah. So the difference between Bitcoin and a Ponzi scheme is, in a Ponzi scheme, the initial investors cash out at some point. With Bitcoin, the initial investors have already cashed out because they have gone through a mental conversion where Bitcoin is the cash.
Right, so they've changed their unit of account.
Right, and the dollar is the dollar is
it's just a valueless virtual currency.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I guess if Satoshi ever sells his coins, then we'll know it's a Ponzi.
Yeah. Yes,
really
that would be a bad sign. So, well, this is one thing that is always kind of silly to me is people say like, you know, the initial investors in Bitcoin could just crash the market at any time.
Well, why would they?
That's exactly like.
And yet I'm holding it because I want it to grow even more.
Why? There's no. Have we ever seen that happen? Like, we've never, like, what are you trying to accomplish if you just dump everything, you know, 1 million Bitcoins into the market or however much you have? Like, of course, you're not really getting your investment out of it, first of all. And second, like, nobody has shown more confidence in Bitcoin than Satoshi himself.
Yeah.
Nobody. So like that doesn't seem very likely. And it's like they don't quite understand the mindset. Well, we should talk about this in the next.
And then the value one.
The next talk, but yeah.
I guess, and this will kind of overlap with that, but also going back to the handicap principle, you talk about this in your proof of work concept article, and it's an argument that I guess I haven't seen it as much lately. I think it's more of a bubble thing because people see it getting bigger and they get afraid of Bitcoin being big.
Yeah.
And that's the argument that Bitcoin mining is wasteful.
Yeah.
Which of course is kind of a meaningless sentence.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So Bitcoin. Oh, we should have just talked. Oh well, whatever. maybe we can review this next time. But Bitcoin mining is anonymous. Anybody can mine. You don't have to prove anybody to anything to do it, other than the proof of work. There's no. There are no requirements to mining other than the proof of work.
Right, and I'd actually say, correct me, but that actually makes it more difficult to come to a consensus. So of course people are going to have to devote even more resources to be able to make a reliable signal to completely anonymous individuals.
Sure. Well, as I said, the handicap principle allows for cooperation between anonymous individuals.
Right, but obviously the costs are going to be much higher when you have that.
Yeah.
And so we would expect much more resources to be devoted to this process. But it's also solving a very important problem.
Yeah, but you know, eventually we might reach a point where, like, Bitcoin's requirements are very, very stringent. Like you can chop the network in half, and once it gets back together, it'll reach a new consensus. You know, you can do all sorts of crazy things to the Bitcoin network, and it will be resilient. And that's a little bit extreme, right? Because Bitcoin is now worldwide. It's not going to get chopped in half, right? So some of these requirements are maybe a little bit more than what we need. And eventually, I think we'll reach a point where the network, the nodes in the network know enough about the rest of the network that the requirement for anonymity is really not relevant anymore. And this doesn't mean that we'll have a centralized system. It just means that we have a database that is repeated enough times around the world, and that the people who have it have enough information.
It's much harder to spoof that information.
Right. So, you know, people worry sometimes about the difficulty going down as the block reward goes down. But if we actually reach a point where Bitcoin is worldwide, like, you don't really need a really high difficulty, because people will know, like, somebody does, you know, somebody releases a bunch of new blocks, right? You're like, well, we know that those didn't exist, you know, a few days ago or whenever. Let's just ignore those, right? So
it's much more difficult for someone to just show up out of nowhere.
Yeah. So eventually we'll reach a point where where we don't really worry about the 51% attack so much, because there is enough of a consensus, and the network has enough knowledge about itself that we can reliably ignore attempts to create a 51% attack. There's kind of an interesting idea called proof of idle, which some cryptography or game theory researcher, I think, has been developing. And the idea is there may be lots of hashing power around, but people, not necessarily much of it is actually being used on Bitcoin anymore.
Unless you can begin to use that as a signal.
So yeah, so what you do is people prove that they have the hash rate, and they can sort of extort money. I shouldn't call it extortion, because it's, you know, it's fine. They just say, like, we won't turn these on, just give us a little bit of, you know, extra money for that. And then the hash rate is much lower than it could be. But you know, if somebody tries to do a 51% attack, the other people just kind of join in to ignore them. And
right. So like them keeping it off is still being invested in the network. It's not invested in attacking the network like you might worry now, right, with someone keeping a lot of hashing power turned off and then suddenly turning it on to do that 51% attack.
So one of the interesting things about proof of idle, and I want to write about this eventually, is that it removes anonymity. So you can't do proof of idle if you are anonymous. You have to be some specific entity that people know who you are. Otherwise, you could do like a Sybil attack, and you could claim to be a bunch of different organizations and just sequentially prove that you have the hashing power, right? So, if we do move to a proof of idle system, that will make Bitcoin mining less anonymous, and that would indicate that would also indicate that we're moving to a state where we're relying less on the proof of work and more just on the fact that we all know that the database existed like a certain state at a particular time, and we're not going to accept.
So there's higher levels of trust.
Yes.
In the network.
Right.
Because otherwise, like this would be the case if that person, if we wanted to allocate money to this person, everyone would have to agree that that person is worth allocating to. So if it's if the person is actually known, it can become much more political unless there's already a lot of high trust among everyone in the network.
Yeah. Okay, now we definitely talked about everything important, but I think so anyway. Yeah, next time we'll talk about the value of Bitcoin, and then after that we're going to talk about altcoins. So we'll have to talk about why proof of stake doesn't work, because I'm really excited about finally figuring out that, and proof of burn, and we'll talk about other kinds of proof of work algorithms and the disingenuous arguments that altcoiners use. Such a fun topic. So, thanks for watching. That's the show. See you next time.